It's February 28, 2024. Inside the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, serial killer Thomas Eugene Creech is strapped to the execution table. At 10 a.m., the execution is set to begin, but there's a problem. The medical team struggles to establish an IV line. They poke, they produced, nothing works after 2 hours of trying. The execution team keeps trying, but the clock is ticking. Eventually, the call is made. They failed, and as at the time of this video, the dangerous serial killer still lives and he remains on death row, waiting for an execution that possibly may never happen. This is the story of just one of many prisoners who defied the odds by surviving their executions. Kenneth Smith. November 17, 2022. Kenneth Smith is strapped to a gurney, minutes away from lethal injection. His execution is set, but just before it commences, a problem arises. At 7:59 p.m., a federal court orders a last-minute stay. His lawyers then rush to inform the Alabama Department of Corrections, but instead of stopping, the execution team presses forward. Smith isn't told. No calls, no explanations, just silence. At 10 p.m., they begin the procedure, but the IV won't take. Again and again, they stab at his veins. The needle digs into muscle instead of a vein. Smith warns them. They ignore him. The pain gets worse. They tilt him backward in an inverted crucifixion. Someone jabs a needle into his collarbone, desperately searching for a vein. Another team member injects him with an unknown substance. Smith protests, but they do it anyway. For over an hour, they try. Smith's body shakes. He sweats. He hyperventilates. By 11:20 p.m., they give up. He's too weak to walk, too exhausted to lift his arms. It's Alabama's third botched execution in a row, but for Smith, it's not over. The state isn't done with him yet, so a year later, they come up with a new plan: nitrogen hypoxia, a method never used before in an execution. Officials call it humane. Critics call it experimental. Smith calls it a step backward for humanity. He survived Alabama's first attempt to execute him, but he wasn't going to survive this next one. You see, Kenneth Eugene Smith was sentenced to death for his role in the brutal murder of Elizabeth Sennett, and after decades of legal battles, he was going to face the consequences. And surviving lethal injection wasn't enough to steer him away from that. It's January 25, 2024, in Alabama, USA, 8 hours before his final execution. Kenneth has just had his last meal: steak, hash browns, eggs. He says goodbye to his wife and sons. At 7:57 p.m., the gas begins to flow. At first, nothing. Then his body starts to shake. He thrashes against the restraints. His chest rises and falls in heavy gasps. Soon, he stops struggling. Then, his body goes still. At exactly 8:25 p.m., Kenneth Smith is pronounced dead. This next prisoner survived his execution in the same way, but the state of Ohio never got a second chance to execute him again. Romel Broom. On 15 September 2009, inside the execution chamber at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, Romel Broom is strapped to the gurney. He's about to pay the price for murdering 14-year-old Trina Middleton, among other crimes. The execution team moves in. They search for a vein. Nothing. They try again and again. 2 hours pass. Needle after needle. Failed attempt. Broom winces in pain. The IV just won't take. The room is tense. The executioners are sweating. Then, the order comes down. Halt the execution. Ohio Governor Ted Strickland has just granted Mr. Broom a 1-week reprieve. But it doesn't stop there. Broom's legal team immediately moves to block a second execution. They argue that trying to kill him again would be cruel and unusual punishment, which is a clear violation of the double jeopardy protections under the 5th and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. They claimed it was double jeopardy because he already survived one execution attempt, and trying again would be punishing him twice for the same crime. The courts don't buy it. 2016. The Ohio Supreme Court rules that the state can execute him again. Later that year, Broom took his case to the U.S. Supreme Court, but he was denied a hearing. Fast forward to 17th June 2020, and his second execution date approaches. But fate steps in again. 2 months before his execution, it gets delayed to 2022. But that delay turns out to be permanent. On 28 December 2020, Romel Broom dies in prison, not from execution, but from suspected COVID-19 complications. A man sentenced to death twice, surviving the first attempt, only to be taken by a virus. But that still doesn't compare to this next prisoner who survived a brutal execution method, only to be taken by old age: William Dewell. William Dewell was just 17 years old when he was convicted of the rape of Sarah Griffin in Acton, London. He was sentenced to death and was set to be hanged at Tyburn on November 24, 1740, alongside 4 others. His execution went as planned. Dewell's body hung for about 20 minutes before it was cut down and sent to the Anatomy Theater at the Worshipful Company of Barbers and Surgeons. There, he was stripped and laid on a board, ready to be dissected. But just as they were about to begin, one of the servants noticed something strange. Dewell was breathing, slowly at first, but then faster and faster. The medical staff acted quickly, bleeding him, and within 2 hours, he was sitting upright. That night, he was taken back to Newgate Prison, where he made a full recovery by the next day. Strangely, Dewell had no memory of the execution, likely due to a fever and delirium he had suffered from at the time. When news of his survival spread, the public was in shock. Authorities, unsure of what to do, changed his sentence to penal transportation. Instead of execution, he was sent to North America for life. Dell spent the rest of his years in Boston and was reported to have died sometime in 1805. Sadly, this next prisoner, who was just as young as Willie when he was sentenced to die, met a worse fate. Willie Francis. Willie Francis, for the murder of Andrew Thomas, a pharmacist who had once employed him. Despite signing 2 written confessions, Francis pleaded not guilty. Many believe those confessions were forced, as he had no legal counsel at the time. In just 2 days, his court-appointed attorneys made no objections, called no witnesses, and offered no defense. 12 white jurors found him guilty, and the judge sentenced him to die, even though he had been only 15 at the time of the crime. On 3rd May, 1946, his execution was set. Strapped into Louisiana's electric chair, known as Gruesome Gertie, the switch was thrown. Electricity surged through his body, but he didn't die. Instead, he screamed from beneath the leather hood, "Take it off! Take it off! Let me breathe!" The chair had been set up improperly by an intoxicated prison guard. The sheriff later remarked, "This boy really got a shock when they turned that machine on." The botched execution gave Francis a second chance, but not for long. Attorney Bertrand de Blanc took on his case, arguing that forcing him to face the chair again was cruel and unusual punishment. De Blanc had been a close friend of Andrew Thomas, and his decision to defend Francis was met with outrage from the small Cajun community. He took the fight all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, citing violations of Francis's 5th, 8th, and 14th Amendment rights, including equal protection, double jeopardy, and cruel and unusual punishment. But the appeal was denied. De Blanc then attempted to overturn Francis's conviction, pointing to new evidence and serious flaws in his trial. But Francis, exhausted from the fight, refused to go through another trial. He told de Blanc to stop. Just 1 year after his first execution attempt, he was sent back to the chair. Days before his death, he told a reporter he would meet the Lord with his Sunday pants and Sunday heart, and at 12:10 p.m. on May 9, 1947, that's exactly what he did. Allen Eugene Miller. Allen Eugene Miller was convicted of the 1999 murders of 3 men in Pelham, Alabama, and sentenced to death in 2000. According to trial testimony, Miller's motive for the killings was that he believed the men were spreading rumors about him being gay. However, a psychiatrist hired by Miller's defense found that he suffered from severe mental illness. Miller was scheduled to be executed by lethal injection on September 22, 2022, but the execution was called off after prison staff failed to establish intravenous access to deliver the lethal injection. It was concluded that they would not be able to complete the execution by the midnight deadline. Following this failed attempt, Miller filed a federal lawsuit. In November 2022, the state of Alabama agreed to abandon lethal injection and instead use nitrogen gas for Miller's execution. On September 26, 2024, Miller was executed by nitrogen hypoxia at the Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. He was pronounced dead at 6:38 p.m. local time. For his last meal, he requested a hamburger steak, a baked potato, and French fries, and his final words were, "I didn't do anything to be in here." That's what this next prisoner should have said, because he didn't survive 1 but 3 executions. John Babacum Lee, John Henry George Babacum, aka the man they couldn't hang, was convicted of the murder of his employer, Emma Keiss, at her home at Babacum Bay near Torquay on the 15th of November, 1884. He was accused of killing her with a knife, but the evidence against Lee was weak and circumstantial, consisting mainly of him being the only male in the house at the time of the murder, his previous criminal record, and an unexplained cut on his arm. Despite claiming his innocence, he was sentenced to hang. On 23rd February, 1885, Lee's execution was set to take place at Exeter Prison. However, 3 attempts were made to hang him, and all failed. The trapdoor of the scaffold failed to open each time, despite being carefully tested by the executioner, James Berry, beforehand. After the 3rd failed attempt, the medical officer refused to take any further part in the proceedings, and the execution was halted. As a result, Home Secretary Sir William Harcourt commuted Lee's sentence to life imprisonment. The Home Office launched an investigation, revealing that the problem with the gallows was due to a misalignment in the drawbar when the gallows was moved from the old infirmary into the coachhouse. This misalignment caused the hinges of the trapdoor to bind, preventing it from dropping cleanly. Lee continued to petition successive Home Secretaries for his release and was finally freed in 1907. He remains one of only 2 men in history known to have survived 3 hanging attempts, the other being Joseph Samuel, who survived a similar fate in Sydney, Australia in 1803. Joseph Samuel was convicted of robbery in 1795 and sentenced to transportation to Australia in 1801, one of 297 felons aboard the vessels Nile, Canada, and Minorca. At the time, Britain maintained a penal settlement at Sydney Cove in the colony of New South Wales, where the isolation of the colony acted as a natural deterrent to escape attempts. However, Samuel managed to escape and, along with a gang, robbed the home of a wealthy woman. In the process, a policeman named Joseph Luker, who was guarding the home, was murdered. The gang was quickly captured, and during the trial, the woman identified Samuel as one of the culprits. While Samuel confessed to the robbery, he denied murdering the policeman. The rest of the gang was acquitted due to lack of evidence, but Samuel was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. On September 26, 1803, Samuel was driven to Parramatta for his execution, along with another criminal convicted of a different crime. Hundreds of people gathered to watch the event. The nooses were fastened around their necks, and the cart was driven away, initiating the slow strangulation method commonly used at the time. The ropes, made of 5 cords of hemp, could withstand up to 1,000 pounds of weight, more than enough for an execution. While the other criminal died by strangulation, Samuel's rope snapped and he fell to the ground, spraining his ankle. The executioner quickly replaced the rope, forcing Samuel back onto the cart. But when the cart was driven away, the noose slipped off and Samuel's boots touched the ground. The executioner, convinced the noose was fastened properly, tried again, but once more, the rope snapped. Samuel fell again, trying to avoid landing on his injured ankle. The crowd erupted, and a policeman on horseback called for a delay while he went to fetch the governor. Upon inspection, the governor and the crowd agreed that the repeated failures of the execution were a sign from God that Samuel was not deserving of death. The town doctor then treated Samuel's sprained ankle before he was sent to prison, where he would spend the rest of his life. The same can't be said for this next prisoner who not only survived, but was pardoned for surviving her execution attempt, Anne Green. Anne Green, born around 1628, was an English domestic servant who was accused of infanticide in 1650. Green became pregnant, but later claimed she was unaware of her pregnancy until she miscarried after 17 weeks. In an attempt to conceal the remains of the fetus, she was discovered and suspected of infanticide. Green was prosecuted under the Concealment of Birth of Bastards Act 1624, which presumed that any woman concealing the death of her illegitimate child had committed murder. Despite the defense testimony, including a midwife's claim that the fetus was too undeveloped to have been alive, and statements from servants confirming Green had been ill for about a month before the miscarriage, she was found guilty of murder. Green was hanged at Oxford Castle on December 14, 1650. At her request, several of her friends pulled her swinging body, and a soldier struck her with the butt of his musket to expedite her death. She was presumed dead half an hour later, and her body was given to University of Oxford physicians William Petty and Thomas Willis for dissection. However, when the physicians opened her coffin the morning after the hanging, they discovered Green still had a faint pulse and was weakly breathing. Petty and Willis, with assistance from other Oxford physicians, tried various methods to revive her, including pouring hot cordial down her throat, rubbing her limbs, and administering a tobacco smoke enema. Over the course of 12 to 14 hours, Green began to speak, and after 4 days, she ate solid food. Within a month, she had fully recovered, though she had no memory of the events surrounding her execution. After her miraculous recovery, Green was granted a reprieve and later pardoned, with many believing that divine intervention had spared her, proving her innocence. Some of her enemies sought to have her re-executed, but intervention from soldiers on her behalf prevented this. Wenceslao Moguel Herrera, known in the press as El Fusilado, Spanish for the Shot One, was a Mexican soldier who served under Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolution. He was captured on March 18, 1915, and sentenced to death without trial. On the day of his execution, he was shot 8 to 9 times by a firing squad. After the barrage, he received the coup de grace, a final shot to the head at point-blank range, intended to ensure his death. Despite these attempts on his life, Moguel managed to survive, though he was permanently scarred and disfigured. There are conflicting stories about how he survived the execution. One version suggests that after being left for dead, Moguel was found unconscious among the bodies of his comrades the following day. He was given medical attention and eventually recovered. Another account claims that Moguel managed to crawl away from the execution site to the Church of St. James Apostle, located 3 blocks away, where a church member found him and helped him recover at their home. Moguel lived on a free man until his death on the 29th of July, 1976. What are your thoughts on these prisoners that survived? Let me know in the comments section, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, then be sure to subscribe and click on this next card on your screen.